The Prairie Harvest. Millions of tons of grain taken from land where once no wheat could grow. Our growing abundance helps to feed a world that every year gets hungrier. Plant breeding has created the crops of modern agriculture, and now new technology promises even greater control over the plants we grow for food. We've engineered our crops to suit a certain style of agriculture. Like the processing tomato, from seed to fruit, it's tailor-made to fit into the ketchup bottle. But our gigantic harvests lack something vital. From the earliest times, farming has relied on a crop's own power to adapt for survival. Soil, climate, disease, local conditions shape the plants that grow here. These seeds are survivors, naturally defended against the risks of this environment. Now we've taken over the defense of our crops, attacking head-on the risks of disease, weather, insects. Often we lose. In 1985, drought destroyed nearly $1 billion worth of prairie wheat. In 1970, 15% of the entire American corn harvest was lost to corn blight. No major crop is exempt. An epidemic of citrus canker devastated Florida's orange groves in 1984. Tens of thousands of young trees were burned, and the continent's orange juice went up in smoke. Crop disasters like these are the result of monoculture, miles of land planted to a single crop. Within the crop, every plant is genetically uniform. In the natural world, diversity is the key to survival, but our crops have been stripped of their defenses. Long ago, in a few small corners of the planet, the climate and the shape of the land nurtured a rich diversity of plant life. In those favored places, human agriculture began. This harvest, in Turkey, comes from a long cooperation between humans and the natural environment. For thousands of years, farmers here have chosen their plants for their ability to survive. From valley to valley, even from field to field, the plants are genetically different. Selected over countless generations and tested by the environment, they're adapted to local conditions. More than 10,000 years ago in this part of Turkey, a great civilization was built on the cultivation of wheat. And today in this countryside, the harvest continues, part of a long and intricate evolution. Thousands of locally adapted varieties of wheat have developed here. They look very different from each other because of their different genetic makeup. Each is resistant to a wide range of local threats. This diversity means they adapt, crossbreeding and mutating in the field, producing new genetic combinations, new potential for survival. These local races of the world's food crops have been the lifelong study of plant geneticist Dr. Erna Bennett.
All those races of cultivated plants that have been grown by man in the villages, in the mountains, in the valleys, in the deserts, and in 100 or 1,000 different environments have, over the course of the years, acquired adaptations to those environments, have acquired a wealth of genetic characteristics, of genetic potentials that represent an enormous reserve from which we can draw to reproduce the same adaptations, but with enormously greater scope and intent.
Out of this potential, we've built our modern crops, but we've bred for high yields. And to control the crop's performance, we've made it uniform, a crop that's lost its flexibility. Around it, the natural world is constantly changing as diseases and insects evolve new strategies.
Boy, there is a lot here tonight, too.
Oh, they're just swarming. It's crazy. Here's, look at...
In a Saskatchewan wheat field one July evening, Wallace McPhee and his son checked their grain for the latest pest to threaten their harvest.
Some onto the stem. 3 or 4 on that stem.
Last year, farmers in the area lost $30 million worth of wheat.
Seem to be quite a few here tonight now.
More than the... Look between these 3 heads here.
This was the culprit, the orange wheat blossom midge.
Maybe they can't get into them.
Yeah, but you can see the odd one real clear, just laying the eggs, eh? Like right here.
2 wet springs have caused a massive rise in numbers, and the crop has no natural resistance. 70% of the wheat in this area is a single variety, all of it vulnerable to the midge.
Well, maybe we'll have to spray it tomorrow.
In a crisis, this is the farmer's only recourse, but it's costly, damaging to the environment, and often unsuccessful. If the eggs have already been laid when the crop's sprayed, they'll hatch out within the head. Larvae suck the juice from the growing kernel. At harvest time, the healthy-looking head contains little more than chaff. Plant breeding is the long-term solution.
There's quite high numbers emerging.
Dr. Tim Wright is an agronomist with Agriculture Canada.
And you can see the number of midge that are stuck to the sticky tape in this trap. These are the midge that have come out of the soil. We have had as many as 300 in a 3-day period. So the population is very high, and if you figure each midge can lay maybe 40 eggs, there's a tremendous potential for damage.
In this midge-infested field, Dr. Wright is growing wheat varieties from places like Turkey, China, and Europe. He's looking for natural midge resistance, perhaps a flower the insect can't penetrate. Any wheat that survives well in the field will be used in a government plant breeding program to transfer midge resistance into prairie wheat. When 2 varieties of wheat are to be crossed, one is emasculated to make sure it doesn't pollinate itself. Each pollen-bearing anther is removed by hand, and there may be 150 in a single head. The painstaking work of plant breeding is endless, as our crops are constantly adjusted to meet the latest novelty thrown at them by nature. The two flowering heads are bagged together, and then, with a flick of the fingers, the marriage is consummated. Plant breeding has given us modern agriculture. Now, high-yielding varieties of all major food crops have been developed, and they're spreading round the world. Here in Turkey, traditional seeds are quickly giving way to new high-yield wheat, bred for a different kind of farming. In many developing countries, the plant breeders' new varieties have brought much larger harvests. But in other ways, this green revolution has been a very mixed blessing.
A great part of the poor, of the populations, in fact, in the Third World are themselves farmers or laborers on the land. And the welfare of those people depends rather on the continuation of an agriculture that can provide them with work than the development of an agriculture that can absorb tractors and expel them. This has been one of the major effects of the new varieties. Whole populations have moved from the countryside, where no longer work is available to them, to the cities, where work is also not available to them.
And now, this ancient, fruitful land is being redesigned. "18 huge dams on the river Euphrates will flood more than 1,000 square kilometers. Irrigation for vast areas of mechanized agriculture. Power for growing cities. Technology alters the face of the earth to suit a new human purpose. But modern agriculture is built on something far more fragile than this. On the slopes above the worksite, Dr. Tuna Ekim harvests weeds, some of them wild varieties of major food crops: barley, oats, alfalfa. We'll never know what genetic potential will disappear underwater here, nor how it might have helped to keep our crops healthy. The complex community of plants on this mountainside has evolved over millennia. Once it's lost, it's gone forever. In Peru, potatoes come in more shapes and colors than North Americans are used to. It's because they're at home here. Peru, like Turkey, is one of those rich corners of the world where many of our food plants first evolved. Several thousand years of cultivation here have produced a startling demonstration of nature's ingenuity. beans, squash, potatoes, corn, tomatoes, ancient treasures of Peru that have enriched the world. They come from small farms in the mountainous countryside, where life still follows traditional patterns. Farmers here must carve their fields out of a rugged landscape. Climate and soil conditions change dramatically over short distances, producing plants of great diversity. Remote areas like this are the source of genetic raw material modern crops depend on. Dr. Charles Rick is a world expert on tomato genetics. He's here with an international group of breeders looking for wild tomato varieties.
Hiding in the corner.
This is a fantastic species because it grows in such exceedingly dry places.
In his lifetime, Dr. Rick has collected most of the wild plant genes that built today's processing tomato.
Better look at these anthers, you know. Yeah, for sure.
Surviving tough conditions, the wild tomato has genetic strengths vital to the tomato industry.
There's a great deal of interest in this for, well, not only for drought tolerance, but the sticky foliage is entraps certain insects like the whitefly, and it is probably our best source of resistance to the greenhouse whitefly.
See, this is this year's growth, and this is the old plant. It's probably 3 years old, 3 or 4 years. This is the one that is very insect resistant. We have yet to find a plant in the wild with insect damage.
These insignificant plants harbor great potential. Today, Dr. Rick discovers a wild tomato he's never seen before. For a plant geneticist, it's an important moment.
Remarkably similar in foliage. This is just sort of on the borderline. But this is really, really most unusual. I think it's quite exciting to find something of this type.
Such finds are getting rarer as human population increases and agriculture expands.
It's not surprising that in many sites where we had collected wild tomato species in the past, going back, say, for 40, 50 years, they no longer exist. They've been eliminated. They're virtually extinct from places like that. Look at the worm coming out. He beat me to that fruit.
In the evening, the seeds are prepared for storage, insurance for the future of our crops.
I think we have to think in terms of the very long range use of this material, and an awful lot of that is totally unpredictable. Almost certainly the plant breeders of the distant future, 50, 100, 200 years from now, are going to have different needs. New problems are going to arise. Certainly, we're not going to be using tomatoes in the same way. We're not going to be growing them in the same way. The pests will be different, and we'll most certainly need new genes for those purposes.
Collections like these are stored in an international network of seed banks set up to conserve the genetic basis of the world's food. Canada's seed bank in Ottawa has more than 75,000 seed samples from wild and cultivated plants, including some major world collections such as barley, oats, and rapeseed. In 2 small offices, staff catalog new acquisitions, answer requests for breeding material, and clean the seed for storage. Seed is not eternal, and even here, it's at risk. Inadequate storage facilities leave many seeds prey to heat, humidity, insects, and mice. No one knows the full genetic potential stored here. Poor funding means that only basic maintenance work can be done. Regular germination tests check the seed's continuing viability. If the germination rate drops, that sample is grown out in the greenhouses for new supplies of vigorous seed. Conservation needs time and money and a new commitment. It's not just a Canadian problem. More seed has been lost in international seed banks than has been saved. It's more than a package of seed. It's a vast treasury of diverse genes, a priceless asset that lies curled within each seed. Plotted on the spiral strands of DNA are the genes that control an endless variety of specific traits. Disease resistance, drought or cold tolerance, high yield ability, or early ripening. Today, they're more valuable than ever. Right now, plant breeders are finding ways of breaking into that treasury, manipulating the very blueprint of life. Under the microscope, 2 cells, stripped of their cell walls, are being fused, combining their DNA. Cells from 2 different plants, even 2 different species, can be put together like this. With this technique, entirely novel plants can be constructed. Already a tomato potato has been grown in a lab. In the future, wheat might fertilize itself like bean plants, or rice might be as protein-rich as soybeans. A genetic trait can be transferred directly once the genes controlling it have been identified. Chemically stripped out from one cell's DNA, they're injected into another cell. When it's perfected, this could cut years from the slow process of traditional plant breeding. Genetic engineering has taken plant breeding out of university and government labs into the competitive world of private industry. DNA Plant Technology Corporation is one of many new companies redesigning plants for the food industry. Dr. David Evans is a biotechnologist.
Well, I guess our next step is to try to increase the regeneration frequency.
Large ones where the green centers are the ones that regenerate. And they're very compact.
Biotechnology has attracted business investment because it promises such control. Each one of these leaf fragments will become a clone of the parent plant. Hundreds of genetically identical plantlets. And every stage of growth is turned on and off in the lab. This is the foundation of a new and profitable growth industry. Cells that can be made to multiply on command. And now, living plants like these can be privately owned. Recent laws in many Western countries allow new varieties to be protected by patent.
I think what is new and exciting is that some of these tools of biotechnology permit us to address more intelligently issues like nutrition, quality of food characteristics, shelf life considerations, things which will have a very positive impact, a very positive social impact on the consumer in the next several years. I can't think of any greater reward than to actually use a scientific discovery or to use a technology such as the tools of plant biotechnology that we've been applying to actually find that it makes its way into the daily life of most of the people in the United States. So clearly I would say that the work that we're doing in linking science to business is extremely rewarding.
Science and business. When the bottom line is profit, the end result is Veggie Snacks.
Dory came to us with a packaging concept and said, make a pepper that fits in my package that's nice and sweet and good tasting and is in the form of a hybrid and in which people will just love to eat and snack on. So
this is really just the first generation of hybrid peppers.
Yeah.
You have quite a few of these in the pipeline, don't you?
Yeah, pepper's so exciting because there's been so little work done with it. And in a short period of time, we've come quite a long way in developing something with ideal snacking characteristics.
I gather from the standpoint of patents, that's moving forward well, and that lawyers still feel optimistic.
I look to probably around the end of this month to have our first total reaction to all of the documents. There's really basically nothing controversial in them in terms of changing any of the relationships. It's just tying things up according to the codes of various states and things that are involved.
What's your feeling on cost, Dick? Do you still think that we can have a shelf price that would be reasonable to the consumer and be attractive to us and to our partner now?
Oh, definitely. I think the profit potential here, given the costs as we see them today, could be enormous for both our marketing partner as well as ourselves.
Well, I think that's very appropriate. Is what's being offered is a new opportunity, an upscale opportunity to enjoy vegetables.
Biotechnology has great promise. But as plant breeding moves rapidly from public programs into private hands, projects like Veggie Snacks may become the reality. And the endless process of maintaining food crops for human needs will take a second place. The processing tomato. It's been created for industry by plant breeding. Tough skins, high yield, simultaneous ripening. And now there's a new goal, increasing the solids content through biotechnology. Competition is fierce. Every percentage point of extra solids means nearly $80 million for the processing industry. But there's always a trade-off. Already, the new tomato has 15% less vitamin C, and it's a major source of the vitamin for North Americans. Less nutrition, cheaper ketchup. Perhaps it's worth it. But as food plants are redesigned for processing and marketing companies, these decisions are made solely on economic grounds. It's good for business, but it may not be good for the future of our food. Seed is the end result of plant breeding. And recently, control of seed has been changing hands. This is corn seed for farmers in southern Ontario. It's produced by Pickseed, a small family-owned firm that's been in the business for more than 40 years. Traditionally, new seed varieties have been developed by companies like this in response to the needs of local farmers. But today, Pickseed is a rare survivor. farming is now an international affair, and the seed business is becoming big business. For agricultural economist Pat Mooney, the new seed merchants are a matter for urgent concern.
The real plant breeders today are multinational corporations, particularly multinational chemical corporations. There have been close to 1,000 seed company takeovers in the last dozen years, and which means that basically all of the traditional multi-generational family seed companies that have served the market for decades and centuries in some cases have been taken over by these international companies. And I think that's a concern, that when you have that concentration in a few hands. But secondly, we should be concerned because these companies are the pesticide manufacturers, the pesticide developers, who are now becoming the plant breeders. And it's very hard to understand why it is that a company which is producing the herbicides for a crop would be very concerned about disease resistance qualities or concerned about weed control problems for that crop, when they can actually refer farmers to the chemical on the shelf rather than doing their own plant breeding.
Chemicals and agriculture. It's a growing partnership. Seeds are now bred to respond to chemicals. They need them to perform. Rising costs trap the farmer in a race for higher yields. This herbicide kills weeds that compete with growing corn, but it lingers in the soil, preventing crop rotation. Alfalfa and soybeans can't grow where it's been sprayed. Herbicide companies are currently spending millions of dollars in plant breeding programs, trying to develop herbicide-resistant varieties of these crops. More herbicide means higher yields and fatter business profits. But already in the American Corn Belt, toxic quantities of herbicide are showing up in drinking water. Farming has always been a risky business, but help is now at hand. There's a chemical solution to most problems in the field. For the farmer, the message is simple. Shell, DuPont, Roman Haas, and Monsanto will guard his fields for him. They'll wrap his defenseless crop from seed to harvest in a petrochemical shield, keep it safe from the hazards of nature. And he can finally relax.
It wasn't that long ago that we actually were concerned about disease resistance. Now it's simply to adapt the seed to the chemical rather than the chemical to the seed. And there's very sound corporate reasons to do that. The corporate logic is that it's faster to do plant breeding and much, much cheaper to plant breed a new variety than it is to change your chemical, to change your pesticide. So it's cheaper for companies to adapt nature to the chemical than the chemical to nature.
The corporate tomato is the ultimate example. Designed for high yield, uniformity, and processing, its performance is controlled by chemicals. Under contract to Heinz, 150 hectares of this farm in Ontario are planted with tomatoes. The seedlings come from Heinz with precise specifications of fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. For food companies, plant breeding provides tight control over the production end of their operation. The food chain is becoming an assembly line that starts with the seed and ends in the can. From tomato juice to the world's grain harvests, corporate investment in the seed business means mass production is the only way to go.
The orientation of the companies is towards the biggest markets. In the past, we've had regional seed companies that have been concerned about a regional market and developing plant varieties for that regional market. And that's made sense. They've looked at specialty crops in specialty areas. Now we have a multinational company that's looking at a global market. So they want to deal with wheat, they want to deal with maize, sorghum, potatoes, the major world crops for the largest possible zone of breeding, a zone of growing of that variety. And what they simply do for the local areas is adapt that variety somewhat to that local area, or not at all. They simply market it to that area, whether it's adapted or not.
This is the new look of tomato farming in Peru. Hectares of processing tomatoes developed in Italy and the US have replaced the locally adapted varieties. All that genetic diversity is lost to the crops it helped to create. Human harvesters work among plants raised in the family of agricultural chemicals. Genetically uniform, the plants are vulnerable to epidemics. This crop is damaged by pinworm and a virus infection. It's already been dusted for fungus. The billboards are Spanish, but the names are familiar. Imported seed means imported fertilizers and pesticides. But the new tomato has caught on here. Understandably, the farmers like its high yield and its durability. Now the consumers are the ones that must adapt. Today, in the market, where tomatoes once came in many shapes, colors, and flavors, only the processing tomato is for sale. Here, where the tomato first evolved, the legacy of generations has disappeared in 20 years, eliminated by agribusiness and its new international seed. Dropping down into a valley in Ethiopia, this helicopter is part of a national effort to stop the same thing from happening here. It's delivering wheat seed to local farmers. Several years of drought have devastated Ethiopia. Almost 500,000 people died. And these farmers were forced to eat the seed they'd saved for planting. They desperately need new seed, but it must be adapted to local conditions, or it won't survive. In past years, imported seed, with its dependence on agricultural chemicals, has further eroded Ethiopians' ability to feed themselves. Now that's changing. This seed was developed here, the beginning of a government program to build long-term independence for the country's food. For many families, it will be a long walk home, several days through the mountains to isolated villages. This is one of the planet's storehouses of plant diversity, and it was badly hit by drought. In the deep valleys clefting the mountains, crops adapted over several thousand years of cultivation were wiped out. Lacking his ancestral seed, The farmer now must try his luck with the government's variety. It has more chance than imported seed, and it's much better than nothing. Lynn Gross is an agronomist in the area.
We would like it to be able to have seed from our own districts because there's such a great variety of ecological differences within Ethiopia with all the canyons and the different rainfall patterns and soil types and so forth. But that this year, you just take what you can get, and we hope that we will be able to get something out of it. And it's down to that point now.
Tough soil and a treacherous climate, conditions that have shaped all life here. Humans, animals, and plants are bound together in the difficult business of survival.
In isolated areas, you lose your crop and no outside resources and so forth to back it up, and no bank to go to or anything to get you out of the hole. Why, it's very, very difficult on these people, but they have managed somehow to hang on in here, and so we're always, I guess, always looking for that little bit of hope that we got to get it in the ground, and we hope we're going to get something out of it.
Seeds for the future will come from the work going on at Ethiopia's new seed bank, directed by Dr. Malaku Warede.
There is a lot of genetic diversity which has to be conserved and used in breeding programs, both nationally and at the global level. Primarily, of course, for the national breeding programs. So a gene bank has to be there to collect, conserve, and effectively utilize the available genetic resources in the country.
In the past, Ethiopian seed has enriched the seed banks of the Western world. Now, even in the midst of the present food crisis, Ethiopia is able to conserve its own resources. There's the heritage of millennia in every handful of seed. The seed bank was founded with help from the German Development Agency. Each seed sample has been tested and cataloged, a record of astonishing diversity that's still only a fraction of what's out there in the countryside. Finding and identifying the genetic resources here is a huge undertaking, but the seed bank has found a way to speed it up. During the drought, collecting in markets and villages, they ask the farmers for help. Intimately connected with the seeds he relies on, the farmer is vital to the Ethiopian conservation network.
You ask a farmer to identify unique types, he will do it in no time for you. Then we can possibly do it. So there is a lot of advantage we are getting from the participation of the farmers in those fields.
Seed is life here, husbanded over generations. The seed bank brings hope of food security for the future.
Basically, what we're concerned with is the enrichment of the life of man. And that we can do when we have access to the total wealth represented by the genetic diversity, not only of man's plants and his animals, but of man himself. These are enormous untapped genetic potentials. And to the extent that we lose them, we lose an enormous, as yet unrealized heritage.
A far corner of the earth caught up in crisis. Its people, torn by drought and famine, touched the heart of the Western world. We rush to help, sending food from our great surplus. But this Canadian wheat is coming home. Long ago, many of our major food crops came from Ethiopia, carried from hidden valleys out around the planet. Wheat, barley, flax, onions, bananas, coffee, gifts from Ethiopia to the people of the world. And Western agriculture still needs the genetic diversity of food plants here, the adaptive vigor that's part of the struggle for life. The world is interlocked in patterns of dependency. What we do here affects our own survival. What they do for themselves ensures the future of our food supply. Understanding this, we see this moment with quite different eyes. Famine at the heart of one of the world's centers of plant diversity. A drought that threatens our own fragile harvest. Nature and human nature have been in partnership for 18,000 years of agriculture. Now, we're going it alone. The power of our technology is immense, but it can never replace the complex, evolving community of life that sustains us all.